Hello, existentialists. Welcome to this transition lecture to our more in-depth study of Heidegger, Heidegger's Being and Time, the lead-up, and two introductions. This is the second video on Heidegger in the course, and you might want to review the first one at this point, which covers a few of Heidegger's attempted more exoteric or public introductions to his work. In this video, and after situating a little bit the life of Heidegger and his intellectual development in the 1920s, we'll attempt to situate in broad outline the basic philosophical perspective opened up in Being and Time, as articulated only in the two introductions to the work. This is thus the moment in the course when, after examining the major players in so-called existentialism and their most enduring contributions, and after our in-depth units on Nietzsche, as well as various pre- and post-existentialisms, we are now, for the rest of the course, going to pursue a more in-depth account of Heidegger's philosophy, starting now with the lead-up to Being and Time and introductions 1 and 2, and moving on to an overall account of the concept of time in Heidegger, the relation of Dasein or human existence to temporality, as well as his answer to the questions: what is philosophy, what is its task or role in the modern era of the world picture, as well as a study of the later Heidegger on themes of poetry and nature, religion and the fourfold, the futural ones, and what Heidegger calls the last God, concluding by the end of the semester with an account of the themes of spirit, poverty, need or necessity, even socialism, no, not National Socialism here, but Russian socialism, in some of his later works. So welcome to our Heidegger unit. Born in the small southern German village of Meßkirch in 1889, Heidegger grew up in this house on which that plaque is now affixed, very near to the church, one of those rare, predominantly Catholic German towns. Heidegger grew up extremely piously, was an altar boy in this church, and the one designated to ring the bells. He recalls in later biographical reflection that the deep enmeshment of his childhood in Christian religious life and its sacred calendar marked the inception as thinking about time and being as fundamental existential phenomena. Time in human life, of course, is always between birth and death. And here you see the cemetery in which Heidegger and the Heidegger family are buried, and the view that it has to the steeple. Death, as it turns out for Heidegger, crucially important for living authentic lives, for understanding human existence in its finitude and mortality, as well as in its openness to being itself in its truth, or the event of being heroicness. More on that in a moment. In the 1920s, while he was teaching, his wife had this cabin in the Black Forest in the yet smaller village of Tottenberg built, and after accepting a post at the University of Freiburg, Heidegger would end up spending much of his adult life in this cabin, devoted to the life of the mind. Here's the famous water spigot, with its characteristic star above. Visitors to the cabin, such as the Jewish poet Paul Celan, would remark on and even write a poem about. I visited the famous Heidegger hut on a beautiful June day, and I'm glad I managed to get some of the best pictures of it that I've ever seen. This is the famous bench quite nearby the cabin, with a commemorative plaque on which we read a saying of Heidegger's: "In thinking, everything becomes solitary and slow, or perhaps by itself and ponderous." And here you see some of the field paths, bridges, and Holzweg, here logging roads, that would all become part of Heidegger's signature pastoral poetic style. This is one of the lecture halls at the University of Freiburg, which he gave lectures in the later 1920s, with its beautiful mural of the god Prometheus sheltering humanity and giving it just a little bit of the knowledge of the gods. Outside this room, there is an installation with the first edition of Being and Time, which has since its publication and will probably always be considered one of the greatest works of the Western philosophical tradition as a whole, on a par with the dialogues of Plato, the lecture notes of Aristotle, Aquinas' Summa Theologica, Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, or Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. And here you see, again outside his hut in Tautenberg, a statue of the religious preacher Abraham of Sancta Clara, who had an enormous influence on the young Heidegger before he eventually broke with Christianity and the church in order to pursue what he called the atheism of thinking. His educational chronology goes a little like this. In 1907, at age 18, he received a copy of The Manifold Meaning of Being According to Aristotle by Franz Montano from one of his mentors, Konrad Grusser. In 1909, he began studying for the priesthood. During this time, lectured as Abraham of Sancta Clara, a figure to which he was still quite committed at age 20. In 1912, he had published various articles critiquing both modernism and psychologism, a common theme for Catholic intellectuals of his day, in a fairly prestigious journal, Der Akademiker. In 1913, he had defended his doctoral dissertation under Heinrich Rickert leading neo-Kantian philosopher. Its title was The Doctrine of Judgment in Psychologism. Before being permitted to teach in the German university system, you actually have to do 2 doctoral dissertations. So in 1915, he defended what is called his Habilitation Shift, this time on medieval philosophy with the title Doctrine of the Categories and Signification in Duns Scotus. At this point, he became licensed to teach philosophy as a Privatdozent, I guess we would say today lecturer or adjunct professor. In 1916, he finally meets Husserl and ends up getting married to Elfriede Petri, a Protestant like Husserl in his circle of acquaintances. And he shortly after converts to Protestantism for a while before abandoning the faith. This time, he taught his first full courses on Hegel and Plato. Seems to have been mostly exempted from duty in World War I on account of a bad heart. By 1918, he was serving at a meteorological station in Berlin-Scholote. In Heidegger's memories, this was a noble, heroic time, yet his position entirely lacked in any danger. In 1919, he got his first paid position as an assistant professor to Husserl at Freiburg. At this point begins the most important events and lecture courses which constitute the lead-up to Heidegger's Being and Time. The essays published during this period, separate from the lecture courses, can mostly be found in this book's supplements, from the earliest essays to Being and Time and beyond. Edmund Husserl, being a very logical thinker, he noted, given Heidegger's upbringing and personality, a strong predilection for life and the religious, so gently nudged him in this direction of applying the methods of phenomenology to the study of religion. Superficial readings of Heidegger often point merely to his deep grounding in ancient Greek philosophy, especially Aristotle and the pre-Socratics. But it is in fact the combination of both these streams of thought, Judeo-Christian and the Greek, which determined his path throughout the 1920s, leading to a fundamental synthesis in his magnum opus. By 1922, Elfriede had his Tottenhauberg hut built. Last, in 1923-4, he had to move to Marburg, where he met Gadamer and Hannah Arendt and Helena Weiss, Hans Jonas, Karl Lewith, Tanabe Hajime, and many others, major figures who would become both colleagues, influences, or critics. His most significant course devoted to ancient Greek philosophy was the 1924 Plato's Sophist. By 1925-6, it seems he was gearing up to write Being and Time, giving such lectures as Prolegomena to the history of the time concept and Logic, the question of the essence of truth. In 1926, he presents Being and Time to Husserl on his 67th birthday, describing it with a dedication to his mentor. The lead up to Being and Time, these are probably the 6 most important lecture courses, although they're all pretty amazing. For a closer study of Heidegger in the 1920s, nothing has or probably ever will surpass the studies of Theodor Kiesiel, the genesis of Heidegger's Being and Time, and John Van Buren, the young Heidegger, Rumor of the Hidden King. The subtitle here being a reference to how Heidegger's lectures were taken among the young intelligentsia, congregated to his classes, having heard the rumors that philosophy again was now being taught from the lectern by an unlikely young prince from the Black Forest. In addition to supplements, this volume, hard to find, becoming Heidegger on the trail of his early occasional writings, various other occasional speeches, short texts crucial for situating Heidegger's Being and Time. Being and Time itself begins with a citation from Plato's Sophist as its epigraph, for manifestly you have long been aware of what you mean when you use the expression being. We, however, who used to think we understood it, have now become perplexed. Heidegger asks, do we in our time have an answer to the question of what we really mean by the word being? Not at all. So it is fitting that we should raise anew the question of the meaning of being. But are we nowadays even perplexed at our inability to understand the expression being? Not at all. So we must first reawaken an understanding for the meaning of this question. The aim of the following treatise is to work out the question of the meaning of being and to do so concretely. The provisional aim is the interpretation of time as the possible horizon for any understanding of being whatsoever. Now, in order to properly situate the centrality of this question to philosophy, ontology, and even to human existence as such, let's look back briefly to 1919, or the KNS seminar. It's the place where Heidegger for the first time turns the science of phenomenology towards facticity, as to the hermeneutics or interpretation of existence or life. In that seminar, we find this stunning diagram, which we can only cover briefly here. What it concerns is an attempt to reconcile to some extent ficta or subjective idealism with the neo-Kantianism that was common in the university system at the time, by utilizing the methods of Husserl's phenomenology applied to life. The pre-theoretical something is like the pre-reflective I, and even the subject itself in unconsciousness. We are pre-theoretical somethings, but maybe also animals are to some extent. This pre-reflective subject is differentiated in terms of a pre-worldly something Heidegger defines as the basic moment of life as such. That is the primal something itself, or the there is something in a pre-worldly state. The pre-theoretical something can also be a world-laden something that is capable of a life world, and of particular spheres of experience. As a whole, the pre-theoretical something or subject of the investigation is both pre-worldly and world-laden. It's not yet emerged into the theoretical consciousness of categorical intuition. The path towards theory, truth, or the truth of being is that through which a pre-theoretical something becomes a theoretical something. The I realizing itself as I, in Fichte, or consciousness becoming self-consciousness, self-knowing subject in Hegel. In the very first instance, we become theoretical somethings when we become formal, logical, objective somethings that is capable of perceiving things that appear to us as what they are in categorical intuition. And this perception of being is motivated in the primal something itself. Through the genesis of this ability, we are able to conceive ourselves and other beings in the world as object-type somethings, that is, to attempt scientific cognition of what they are. This is one of the motivations of the genuine human life world. What Heidegger is pointing towards here is how we are at once pre-theoretical and becoming theoretical at the same time. Becoming theoretical is in a sense the genesis of cognition, language, knowing beings as beings, perception, the concept, and even logic. The pre-theoretical is the domain of what Heidegger will call in being in time the ontic. Some of the beings among the ontic develop a theoretical faculty, become theoretical somethings, as their very beings are somehow bound up, not only with being a being among beings, but of understanding beings in their being. So this still very technical and scholastic diagram be considered as crucially important. Heidegger's repurposing phenomenology, the way to the basic outlook of being in time, which Dasein or human existence is the type of being who pre-understands being in some sense and on the way to being in its truth, that is, on the way to theory. During this period, Heidegger hopes that the problems of abstract logic will recover their phenomenological roots in life by way of a transcendental a priori exposition of the primal, pre-worldly, pre-theoretical something. At the same time, he hopes that each consciousness, as uniquely world-laden, will recover the singularity of its concrete historicality. What the schema gives us to read is the double nature of the primal something and its life world as prior to and yet simultaneous with the genesis of the theoretical relation. In this sense, not only before, but on the way to or fated, destined to theory, and later terminology to ontology, the knowledge of being. Theodor Cassiel reads the KNS diagram as concerning two events and how we interpret them. On one hand, there is the kairos, the moment, kairology, what will eventually become existentiell Dasein, here the pre-theoretical something. On the other, there is the method of formal indication, attempts to uncover existential structures of this pre-theoretical something. And this is the theoretical dimension. Both together constitute the most essential but largely unspoken core of the book published in 1927. Notice that Heidegger's project here, its first not quite fully worked out beginnings, is not only a logical project, for example, to retrieve ancient Greek logic as ontology, over and against the mere use of logic as a tool in modern philosophy. It also has a historical dimension. We really want to do phenomenology of life. To understand the genesis of our theoretical consciousness, we must go back to history, specifically to religion. Here Heidegger in part locates the genesis of our philosophical consciousness in the tradition of Christianity from Paul to Luther, and places this alongside the Greek aspect, focused on wisdom and the metaphysical, its phenomenology of the apparent, of what appears, the ex-phenestic. Both of these legacies then intertwine in being in time, tradition of Greek philosophy and its ontological logic, helping us to explain truth as disclosure, and the experiences of early Christian religion, helping us to locate the unfolding of our being and way of being in the world within historical temporality. That is, within presencing and represencing, paraousia. In the end, the pre-theoretical something which becomes a theoretical something never does so all at once, but only in the fullness of time, that is, in history. And this is why we need the historical dimension, the specific form it takes in the Christian conversion experience. For it is in the moment, the kairos of religious epiphany in Ur-Christianity, that humanity acquires a new kind of phenomenological insight, one that will help us understand what is revealed or the phenomena uncovered in the theoretical way of life in ancient Greek philosophy. The way Heidegger utilizes these two streams or traditions in the 1920s also points back to his 1915 second dissertation on Duns Scotus' principle of individuation, which he defended with a test lecture entitled The Concept of Time in the Science of History, a text you can find in supplements, which marks Heidegger's entry into the career of a Catholic philosopher, a medievalist, and as will prove fatal to both, a philosopher of time and history. In the conclusion of the thesis, he speaks of a, quote, historical shaping of the problem of the categories. The categories of logic that we inherit are not eternal, subject to modification, based on the shaping forces of our history. And what he hopes is to trace this historical shaping back to the idea of a cosmos of categories, that is, a variety of categorically definitive and logical worldviews. He sees Duns Scotus' notion of singularity as a principle of immanence, removing the world to some extent from the transcendence of God or being, is an essential step in understanding how it is possible we have such historically variable, nevertheless true categories, that there is not one authentically correct cosmic logic. This leads Heidegger to a here post-Hegelian philosophy of living spirit, here underlining the priority of life, rather than the priority of logic in the generation of philosophical thought, which is as such essentially historical spirit in the widest sense of the word. How living spirit or subjective human existence, how living spirit or human existence becomes historical spirit is always in the temporal moment. And in his 1920 to 21 Phenomenology of Religious Life lectures, he utilizes what is called the Pauline Kerygma, the scene of conversion to faith, more deeply explain the pre-theoretical something and the theoretical something in terms of its primordial embeddedness in a religious life world. The human being in the Pauline description is something that always becomes and comes to be. This genesthai is the pre-theoretical something. At the same time, it always comes to see and to know, eidenai, the theoretical something. And it does so within the unfolding of time and history, both in the individual life and beyond it. It is always opening through becoming and seeing, coming to be and knowing, to accepting and receiving, accepting what it is as an embodied life, receiving its self-understanding through tradition. And in this way, it enters into the moment of the turning. This is the first turn in Heidegger's path of thought. And through turning into the whole of this structure on its other side, the human being becomes one who serves and awaits. Is to trust in this primordially theoretical or temporal historical process, to serve the work of faith, to await the endurance of hope, contrawise to await the work of faith and to serve the endurance of hope. All these structures come together, according to Heidegger, in what Paul calls the suffering of love. And of course, these are the three main theological virtues in the Christian tradition, all ultimately conspiring at the opposite end of mere living or becoming, seeing, and knowing, in the experience of being in front of God. Of course, in the later Heidegger, this part of the diagram will be replaced simply by being itself. Heidegger thinks he has provided here a formal description of the moment of Christian conversion, or the Kerygma. He describes it as a primordial theoretical new destruction of the situation within the theoretical itself, and a modification to a more original way of seeing. We can see already how Heidegger's roots are very diverse and complicated. Take a long study to fully unpack all of this. The broadest outlines we have in the K&S diagram a modification, a basic worldview of modern philosophy in light of the phenomenology of life. In the dissertation work, we have a recognition of the historicity of the very way we think about the world as the embeddedness of our very categories in the phenomena of individuation, time, history. In ancient Greek philosophy, we find the most well-developed logical analysis of being itself and its categoriality which changes within the historical religious experience of Christianity in accordance with the Kerygma, one particular way in which historical experience of ourselves and the logic of being is changed at the outset of the Common Era. The common theme that traverses these traditions and responses is the question of truth, or truth's native ground. Where is truth? Heidegger's characteristic first response here is to say that truth is not a characteristic of judgment, but instead a fundamental determination of the Dasein, openness of human beings themselves. So being true or being open is not at all primarily rooted in discourse, logos as such, but in Dasein. This overturns Aristotle's statement that the locus of truth is the statement. In light of other insights elsewhere in Aristotle, the phenomena of truth is really about the being true or the being open of human existence itself to the world in its manifestation and to our thinking of what it is. At last, bringing together all these threads, by the mid-1920s, Heidegger is going to propose if we want to give a logos, that is, to explain, to ground the very phenomenology of our human existence, our Dasein, being there or being in the world, we're going to have to learn how to interpret better. This means recovering both the ancient and the modern art of hermeneutics. Hermeneutics first being introduced to ancient Greek thought in Plato's work, specifically the dialogue The Ion, where the poet or rhapsode is seen as the hermeneut, the interpreter of another poet and in turn of a god. And Heidegger is also here grounding himself on the legacy of hermeneutics in the 19th century, in especially Wilhelm Dilthey and Schleiermacher. What we have not yet been able to do appropriately is to interpret the very structures of the being of Dasein in terms of the understanding of being that belongs to Dasein itself. To do this, we will need a logos of the phenomenology of Dasein, and this leads Heidegger to his notion of a hermeneutic or interpretive phenomenology of factical dailiness. This is already a big stretch from the strictures placed on phenomenology by Husserl. In Husserl, phenomenology is always transcendental phenomenology. In order to adequately describe the phenomena, we must bracket it and reduce out extraneous phenomena that do not contribute to the description. But in Heidegger, phenomenology becomes phenomenology of historical life and thus has an irreducible hermeneutic or interpretive dimension. However, it begins not merely from the study of poetry or scripture, philosophical texts in which the specific conceptuality being deployed is already determined. Rather, if we want to do hermeneutic phenomenology of life or human existence properly, we must begin in everydayness, what he initially calls factical dailiness. Simply, we begin with the facticity of Dasein. This facticity is, by 1924-5, defined as 1. Ownness, thisness, always my experience of Dasein, Gemeinigkeit. As well, the facticity of Dasein is always a temporal particularity, or singularity, that is, a Jeweiligkeit, whiling within the world and along with it. Practical Gemeinigkeit isolates the singular phenomena to be studied as occurring to me, as in some sense mine. Practical Jeweiligkeit, or duration and temporalization, invites us to awaken and be sober to the a priori structures that determine every being in, every factical experience, every ownness and thisness. So enough being said on that, let's turn now to the first introduction to being in time beyond the preface, which is titled The Necessity of an Explicit Repetition of the Question of Being. According to Heidegger, we need to repeat the question of the meaning of being because it has been more or less forgotten since the time of the ancient Greeks. Closest to them and yet still miles away, Kant tried to rekindle metaphysics, but in a much more limited form. In Heidegger's time, neo-Kantian metaphysics is all the rage, but there is something Kant forgot. He taught that being is not a real predicate. When we say that something is, we say more or less nothing that is not universal, and thus trivial. This is Kant's forgetting of being, and even attempt to spare himself from the exertion of rekindling a gigantomachia perites ousias, that is, to rekindle the very subject matter of ancient Greek thought, from the pre-Socratics to Aristotle, as a battle of the giants concerning being. This problematic sustained the avid research of Plato and Aristotle, but from then on ceased to be heard as a thematic question of actual investigation. But what Plato and Aristotle achieved has been preserved in various distorted and camouflaged forms down to Hegel's logic. What was it exactly that the ancient Greek thinkers wrested from phenomena by the highest exertion of thought, albeit in fragments and first beginnings, and which has long since been trivialized? The task of Heidegger's being in time is here clearly stated in the form of a myth, to reawaken this gigantomachia, or battle of the giants concerning being. And originally this gigantomachia was between the Platonic Academy and the Sophists. It was the Academy attempting to speak on behalf of being against the world of the Sophists, as ejected into mere sophistics and heuristics amidst the ontic, so incapable of fully working out the relation of being and non-being, or the nothing. Heidegger later looks back at this intention and notes that the fundamental ontological, that is, seeking of a theory of being itself, laying of the ground for metaphysics in being and time, must be understood as a retrieval. A retrieval of what? Of ancient Greek philosophy. He writes in 1929, the passage from Plato's Sophist, which opens the study, serves not as a declaration, but rather as an indication of the fact that in ancient metaphysics, the gigantomachy over the being of beings had already broken out. And so Heidegger's breakthrough career moment is devoted to formulating anew this question of being. What is being? We can ask what each particular being is, but to formulate the question of being itself, we need a new approach, as well as a faith and a hope, perhaps. It is through answering this question of being that we may be able to ground both metaphysics and the various regional sciences. The whole work is, in this sense, extended argument for the primacy of ontology. The ontological question was indeed investigated by ancient philosophers, but then covered over by medieval and modern ones. Heidegger notes it was first treated by Parmenides in the 5th century BCE, who distinguished on being from meon, non-being. For Parmenides, being is one and non-being is impossible. But what does it even mean to us today to say that being is one? We're not sure. One thing only is clear: being and beings are different. This is known as the ontological difference. Now, at this point, the first introduction pivots to a statement of what he is not doing. Heidegger is not searching for or trying to prove the existence of God with this question of being. He is not asking about the highest entity, but about what it is that accounts for the fact that there is anything at all. This question of being itself is furthermore of more than merely academic interest, because we ourselves exist. The question of being seems almost too intimate, too near to the kind of beings we ourselves are to be closely examined. How can we make any progress in answering the question concerning the meaning of being, or the sense of being, the Seinsinn? What we mean when we say being? Here Aristotle proves to be the most helpful, for in him and in Franz Brentano's analysis, being is spoken of in many ways: contingency and necessity, being true and being false, potentiality and actuality, and being in the sense of the categories. Throughout these manifold ways that we mean things when we say being is also in Aristotle referred to a single principle, that is, to a univocity, something being said in the same way, even though it is spoken of differently or equivocally. In Aristotle's metaphysics, being qua being, or to on he on, is the very subject of metaphysics. And here Aristotle answers that what being is primarily is substance or beingness, ousia, not simply something that is present, but presence, and even presencing. Individual realms of being we might choose to study now and then. The realm of the onta is chemistry, biology, psychology, and the subjects of the other sciences. Aristotle indeed focuses on these, but also claims that metaphysics, study of being as being, studies the unmoved mover, an individual being, with Christianity's emphasis on a higher being, indicates for Heidegger how the problematic of the question of being is not yet fully worked out even in Aristotle. We can raise this question of the meaning of being without automatically assuming we are referring to a highest being or what is most in beingness. Heidegger is therefore going to attempt to short-circuit this Aristotelian closure on the question of being in light of a deeper meditation on the equivocity of being, the manifold ways in which being is said, but by approaching each term in this fourfold distinction in terms of a new method and approach. We already see that what we discussed earlier as formal indication and chirology, the K&S schema of the pre-theoretical something becoming a theoretical something, could be thought richly in light of the fourfold distinction of being, especially being in the sense of the categories, and being as potential or actual being, but also in the sense of being true, and of the moment, in which being and beings come together just so, symbebikos. Now, on the medieval and modern treatment of being, he notes that since Aristotle and on his basis, being has been treated according to a prejudice, and this prejudice is itself fourfold. According to the philosophical tradition, being is the most transcendental concept, not inhering in any given being, nevertheless instantiated in all of them, as well transcending them all. It's also been treated as the most universal concept, a thing that everything which is most participates in and shares without qualification, pure universality. And by being the most universal, the concept of being is even said in Hegel to be devoid of content. It is undefinable, since there is no higher concept by which to define it. So, being the most transcendental, universal, devoid of content and undefinable idea, it comes to be understood as what is most self-evident, because we use it every day, such as in the predication, "the sky is blue." All of these for Heidegger are prejudices which come down to Kant's dictum that being is not a real predicate. If we think this way about being, we will never be able to raise the question of being at all. On his way towards overturning the prejudices, Heidegger admits that being is not a clear concept, but the most obscure of all, and how the obscurity of being conflicts with the fact that we live always in an understanding of being nevertheless. Hegel defined being after a long gigantomachia concerning it as the indeterminate immediate. The sheer obtuseness of these formulations show how the question of being has not yet in the Western tradition, at least until Heidegger, been well formulated. How do we question being? And thus, in the second section of the first introduction, we hear of the formal structure of the question of being. In part emerges out of Plato's knower's paradox. How can we search for what we do not know unless we already know it in some sense? Heidegger concurs, to investigate being, we must have some knowledge of being already. If you think this is an unacceptable tautology and circularity, you will never understand Heidegger's method of the hermeneutical circle, or how ontotautology, what we mean when we say something by saying the same, above all when we say that something is in fact a valid method of phenomenological investigation into any given problem. General modern sensibilities much prefer logic of strict definition than the interpreter of our hermeneutic task of evaluating our definitions in terms of what they both say and leave unsaid. In this way, determined by history and unintegrated metaphysics, we begin always with an average and vague understanding of being. Indeed, this understanding has been contaminated by the philosophical theories of being that we inherit. Given all this, we can find no better starting point than to investigate the very simplicity of being. Being is always the being of an entity. What is most strange or uncanny in this thinking of being is its simplicity. Precisely this simplicity keeps us from investigating it in a more penetrating manner. How do we start to investigate the simplicity of being? Well, simply with the types of beings that we ourselves are. Dasein is an entity which does not just occur among other entities. Say that Dasein, being there, human existence is, or saying something more than that the stone is or that the sky is blue. Rather, Dasein is ontically distinguished by the fact that in its very being, that being is an issue for it. And this is true even in the starting point of René Descartes. I say, I think, therefore I am. But I really mean to say, inverting the terms here, as Unamuno did last week, I am, therefore I think. The I am is the very being of my Dasein, results because of the kind of being that I am and an additional predicate, thinking. Heidegger does not want to begin even here with the Cartesian subject, rather to investigate human existence, Dasein, phenomenologically and hermeneutically, as that being who, in its very being, has being as an issue for it. In fact, understanding of being is itself a definite characteristic of Dasein's being, and the ontic distinctiveness of Dasein among beings is the fact that Dasein is ontological. So we've arrived at the first sure starting point for our investigation into the question of the meaning of being, which is the existential analysis of Dasein itself. In the first instance, the type of being that is Dasein is existence, which Heidegger here spells it with a Z, existens. Dasein understands this existens in terms of the possibility of being itself and the possibility of not being itself, i.e. in being and our to be, we understand the possibility of not being, not to be. Eventually, a theme returned to in Being and Time in terms of the existential analysis of being towards death. We can try to come to terms with existence through existence itself. This seems to be what the Spanish existentialists such as Ortega and Gasset and Unamuno attempted in the previous 2 weeks. And it also seems to be the roots of Sartrean existentialism. What is human existence? Well, let's exist and find out, or existence is prior to essence. All of this for Heidegger is not the correct starting point if our aim is to raise the question of the meaning of being. And here he introduces a key linguistic distinction which may seem trifling but is deeply important between the existential dimensions of Dasein, that is, existence as it is lived, and the existential structures of Dasein, that is, our existentiality, being of our beingness. Heidegger's goal in Being and Time will be to analyze the ontological structures of existentiality. what it means for Dasein to be. Not simply to assume that by mucking about in the stream of life, the Dasein will have authentic existential experiences. There's a common misunderstanding among other existentialist thinkers, very often based on either a non-reading or radical misreading of Heidegger's text. Next, according to Heidegger, science is great, but what it does is to move and sometimes even muck about in the ontic, that is, in beings. The real movement of the sciences always takes place in the revision of its basic concepts, a revision which is more or less radical and lucid with regards to itself, science. Each science's level of development is determined by the extent to which it is capable of a crisis in its basic concepts. This insight will eventually inform Thomas Kuhn's understanding of the scientific paradigm. Now it is in fact subject to radical revision by the very definition of science. Well ahead of his time, Heidegger writes, in these imminent crises of the sciences, the relation of positive questioning to the matter in question becomes unstable. This is indeed what happened post-Einstein in his theory of special and general relativity, the movement towards quantum mechanics. As we'll see, themes that Heidegger takes up explicitly in his lecture The Concept of Time next week. What the sciences always presuppose in their sphere of activity and development is a specific ontology. The real movement of the sciences takes place in the revision of its basic concepts, and science still does not have any type of adequate answer for the types of beings that we ourselves are. Human being, essence or existence, consciousness, spirituality, or other properties are still great mysteries in science. We turn to science to attempt to answer the fundamental question of the meaning of being itself? No, because science assumes a particular perspective on being, as a particular ontology, in all of its more regional experiments, pursuits and theories, and methods of approach. If we want to answer the question of the meaning of being, in fact it is Dasein that has priority. Heidegger calls this the ontic priority of Dasein. Why does Dasein have an ontic priority among beings for raising the question of the meaning of being? Because Dasein is defined by existence, while other things are defined differently. Again, the ontic distinction of Dasein lies in the fact that it is ontological, i.e. Dasein's existence is that of a questioner of being, but this questioning in existence and its existential way of being is pre-ontological. And here Dasein looks a bit like the primal something, the way to becoming an ontological something. Now, the pre-ontological nature of Dasein, qualifying it for an investigation into the very notion of being. Ontological difference can be intellectually stated. Beings are not the same as being. Only from the perspective of a Dasein, Dasein is a being in a world of beings, who by nature of its very being is ontological, and so is the primary being to be interrogated and the basis of all questions concerning ontology. The existential or ordinary way of being of Dasein, again, Dasein always understands itself in terms of its existence, its possibility to be itself or not to be itself. Furthermore, Dasein has either chosen these possibilities itself, stumbled upon them, or in each instance grown up in them. Existence is decided only by each Dasein itself in the manner of its seizing upon or neglecting its possibilities. So we come to term with the question of existence only through existence itself. There is, in other words, no knowledge of the existential structures or Dasein's existentiality that is not in the first instance grounded on our existential understandings. In this sense, we can say that the question of existence is itself an ontic affair of Dasein, something that we do. For this question, the theoretical transparency of ontological structures of existence is not at first necessary. The question of structure, what the existential analysis of Dasein hopes to reveal, aims at the analysis of what constitutes existence. Yet always the roots of any existential analysis of structure are ontic, ultimately existential. Only when philosophical research and inquiry are grasped in an existential way as a possibility of being of each existing Dasein does it become possible at all to disclose the existentiality of existence and therewith to get hold of a sufficiently grounded set of ontological problems. Very abstract, but what Heidegger means here is actually pretty simple. He's pointing to the outcome of the existential analytic of Dasein, i.e. the very ontological structures that determine Dasein's existence. These will be explored meticulously across both Division 1 and Division 2 of Being and Time. They are structures such as, well, being there, being in the world, being in, disclosedness, clearing the there, worldhood of the world, and so on and so forth. All of these are, according to Heidegger, the basic existential structures of Dasein. accounting for the very structure or ontological preconditions of our way of being. Next, in the first introduction, Heidegger explicitly addresses the problem of circularity. We must first determine the being of Dasein, but the goal of this treatise is to investigate being. So how can we understand being through an investigation of Dasein when we must first understand the being of Dasein? This is the problem of circularity. For Heidegger, it's not so much of a problem because, as Dasein, we have a pre-investigative understanding of being, but one that is simply undeveloped and must be further fleshed out. So there is no deductive argument here and no formal fallacy. This method of investigation, beginning from the being of Dasein, hoping from there be able to work out the question of the meaning of being itself, Heidegger terms the hermeneutical circle. This leads us to the second introduction to being in time, viewing the being that each of us is, and to which we are ontically nearest, is ontologically furthest away, and yet is not pre-ontologically unknown to itself. And so in pursuing this ontological elucidation of the existenz of Dasein through the hermeneutical circle, Heidegger is cautious not to admit of any evidence complexes that might obscure Dasein. Philosophical psychology, anthropology, ethics, politics, poetry, biography, historiography, all wonderful fields, but all, like the regional sciences, tending to import assumptions about the nature of Dasein and the world, which have not undergone strictly this method of pre-ontological to ontological elucidation. When we do all of these things, we do so, like in the sciences, always on the basis of metaphysical assumptions, whether we make these thematic or not. So we would do well in pursuing the question of the meaning of being in the first instance to suspend what Husserl called the phenomenological reduction, or epoche, the specific ideological perspectives that we inherit the various disciplines that study Dasein and its history. This theoretical embargo is justified since we cannot leap into an existential analysis of all these phenomena right away. Their understanding has been sedimented in these fields. This is what the hermeneutical approach must first of all dismantle. Such embargoes are thus extensions of Husserl's method of transcendental phenomenological epoche, and their purpose is to clear our access to Dasein's existenz. This seems like a very radical version of Descartes' skeptical starting point. Remember how Descartes suspended belief in anything that was not clearly and distinctly shown by reason to be true? So came to doubt the existence of the external world itself, and even the truths of mathematics. Though Descartes is one of the targets in Being in Time, something like this skeptical approach animates this orienting gesture, cementing Heidegger's debt to Husserlian phenomenology, informing the work Being in Time as an attempted new beginning, which does not take for granted the findings of the humanities, aims to clear Dasein's existenz anew, so as to provide, for the first time, authentically hermeneutic and phenomenological account of the very structures of our existing. What a radical project indeed, and even more so since the starting point for this existential analysis of Dasein must be everydayness. As Heidegger writes, the manner of access and interpretation must instead be chosen in such a way that this being can show itself to itself on its own terms. Furthermore, this manner should show that being as it is initially and for the most part is in average everydayness. By looking at the fundamental constitution of the everydayness of Dasein, we shall bring out in a preparatory way the being of this being. Notice here, while the existential structures of Dasein in Division 1 are developed from everydayness, from our everyday being in the world, they are organized by and large by the logical conceptual clarity and hints concerning the very existence of being of the Aristotelian legacy. It's the Greek stream in Heidegger's thought, whereas the existential structures focused on in the transition to Division 2 go beyond the essential definition of Dasein as care, which we also find in Greek philosophy, in order to be oriented by existential structures clearly articulated in the Judeo-Christian legacy from St. Paul to Kierkegaard. Heidegger's synthesis of Greek conceptuality, the primordial Christian Kerygma or moment of turning and here from inauthenticity to authenticity, is often unnoted. We can see, just in most general outline, the analyses of the earlier 1920s, especially the KNS schema and the Pauline Kerygma, its focus on time and history, as a turning towards God or being, in fact informed the entire synthesis and movement of Heidegger's Being in Time and its structural coherence. Looking ahead to later parts of Being in Time, Heidegger notes that the transition of the work will be from everydayness to authentic temporality, from Division 1 to Division 2. that by division 2, the meaning of being, of that being we call Dasein, will prove to be temporality, Zeitlichkeit. In a way, the analysis of everydayness in division 1 is oriented more by spatiality, and division 2 by temporality. A temporality made existentially transparent through a turning towards the horizon or the event of being, first laid out in its full structure in primordial Christianity. Heidegger acknowledges a caveat here. Even when we interpret Dasein as itself temporality, not yet arrived at an answer to the guiding question about the meaning of being in general. Nevertheless, temporality is the soil from which we may prepare such a movement to fundamental ontology. And it is significant here that Heidegger at first had submitted only division 1 of being in time review to the tenure board at Freiburg, and division 2 much more hastily as it was required, never in fact getting to division 3. The fundamental meaning of being in general was to be elucidated, or to part 2 of the work, which situated why the history of philosophy, so far drawn close to and yet missed, the radicality of this thematic project. Indeed, if the question of being is to achieve clarity regarding its own history, we need a loosening of the sclerotic tradition and a dissolution of the concealments produced by it. This is, in the second introduction, first mention of the great Heideggerian theme of destruction or dismantling, and Jacques Derrida's Reframing Deconstruction. Very often, deconstruction is touted about as a basically destructive or even nihilistic philosophy associated loosely with postmodernism, as an emptying out of the grounds, traditional metaphysical systems, and the security of the ontotheological vision of the world. In Heidegger's Being in Time, destruction or dismantling is deployed as a method because our philosophical traditions have buried the authentic philosophical problematic. Most clearly, in their prejudices concerning the concept of being, inability to think about being itself independently of some highest being. In Heidegger, as in Derrida, this method of destruction or dismantling is the opposite of a merely destructive, obligatory gesture. Destruction does not wish to bury the past in nullity, it has a positive intent. Its negative function remains tacit and indirect. We are really to understand what the great thinkers of our tradition and other traditions have thought, and even to discover the fundamental positions of previous epochs, cannot take positive philosophy for granted. In the first instance, shake up our tacit and indirect assumptions. Only then will we unveil the positive intent of what was actually achieved in the philosophies of the past. So for Heidegger, the destruction of the history of ontology essentially belongs to the formulation of the question of being. The ontological difference, the difference between beings and being, is one of the hardest thoughts, constantly reburied across the history of ontology. The question being itself means to destruct or dismantle traditional ontology. Heidegger here quotes as evidence of the value of this approach. Despite all his essential advances, Kant still just dogmatically adopted Descartes' basic position on the schematizing thinking subject, basic outlook on the world. Is this res cogitans, or thinking thing, as a thing, that is, as a being, is Heidegger's next question. He notes that the res cogitans from Descartes to Kant is ontologically determined as a thing, an ens. And also that for the whole of medieval ontology, the meaning of the being of the thing, of the ens, is established in its understanding of all ends of all things as ens creatum, created beings. As the ens infinitum, God is the ens increatum, is uncreated and responsible for all created things. However, createdness in the broadest sense of having been produced is an essential structural moment as well in the ancient concept of being. Ancient Greeks had spoken of beings by and from phusis, having their principles of motion, form, and final goals in themselves, and also of technai onta, or beings that were technically produced, either human artifacts or the world itself, for example, by a cosmic demiurge. This whole way of thinking about the being of beings as a whole, the beings in nature, is already pre-decided. The very nature of a thing is that it is something created by a thinking subject, the human being or God. And in this way, one part of Greek philosophy is simply imported to the medieval philosophical picture and betrays for Heidegger the imposition of an ill-fated prejudice. If the foundations of modern philosophy rest on the thinking subject as a thing, the res cogitan as a subject, this is because the entire tradition, both Greek and Christian, rest on an inadequate interpretation of the human being. In Plato, the human being is a soul in a body. In Aristotle, a rational animal. In Augustine, a creature of God. In Descartes, a thinking subject, or ego cogito. in Hobbes a material mechanism, in Kant a transcendental ego, and in Hegel an absolute subject. All these traditions are valuable as far as they go, but they all miss the very existence of Dasein. They assume that we know in one way or another what the human being essentially is, and proceed in their ontology from that basis. The doctrine of the soul has a long history from the pre-Socratics and Plato to Hegel, precisely an example of the types of ideological pre-understandings of the very nature of the human being we must forego and suspend. We are to approach the existence of Dasein anew, that is, with the method of phenomenology. So, in section 7, we hear now of phenomenology as primarily signifying a concept of method. The term phenomenology expresses a maxim that can be formulated to the things themselves. It is opposed to all free-floating constructions and accidental findings, and also opposed to taking over concepts only seemingly demonstrated, and likewise to pseudo-questions which are often spread about as problems for generations. What phenomenology promises in Heidegger's repurposing of it is a renewed access to the very description of Dasein in its existence, rather than relying on the inherited dogmas or obscurities which have not yet undergone the process of dismantling. And in this way, the method of phenomenology is the very way in which Heidegger will pursue his peculiar dismantling of the Western philosophical tradition as a whole. The definition of phenomena, he writes, the meaning of the expression phenomena is established as what shows itself in itself, what is manifest. In Greek, to delon. Phenomena are to be distinguished in Heidegger from semblances, appearances, and mere appearances. And semblance, appearance, and mere appearance are all privative modifications of phenomena, as what manifest themselves as themselves. Phenomena, the self-showing in itself, means a distinctive way something can be encountered, and being covered up is the counter-concept to phenomena. This may seem to be fairly obscure and mere wordplay, but it's deeply rooted in the Greek philosophical tradition of distinguishing between being and appearance. If phenomena can be grasped at all, then they are that which precedes semblance, appearance, and mere appearance, and are self-showings of the very being of something. That is, manifestations into openness. To be sure, ancient Greek philosophers often spoke in this way about what is evident or manifest, and as well modern philosophy grounded itself on this kind of talk. It emphasized clear and distinct ideas and the search for certainty, rather through a priori reason or the empirical sciences. The fundamental question here in Heidegger's analysis of phenomena is indeed no less the entire finding of philosophy as a whole. Does it reveal the world to us? Can we, through philosophy as phenomenology, discover a self-showing appearance Greeks would have called exphenestic, something which shines forth from itself and is insusceptible to skeptical doubt or conceptual subdivisions? Heidegger, the answer to this question is yes, although the phenomena he will pursue in Division 1 of Being and Time will be far less grandiose and cosmic than, say, in Plato's Symposium, where that which shines forth most clearly, nothing other than the beautiful itself, a messenger or avatar of the good. That for Heidegger would be a metaphysical importation. Heidegger thinks we can access phenomena, but at the same time that we must do so with extreme caution. Every phenomenological concept and proposition drawn from genuine origins has a tendency to degenerate when communicated as a statement. What is phenomenal? Simply what shows itself, but how to talk about this revelatory or manifestive dimension of Dasein and being in the world without digressing into an epistemological debate. Heidegger will proceed cautiously and methodically here, while insisting that doing phenomenology of Dasein as hermeneutics interpretation is indeed possible. And for this effort to be successful, must investigate not only the word phenomena in phenomenology, but also the word logos. Does discourse about phenomena, the logos of what shows itself, really operate? Later conceptions of discourse took it for granted that it means reason, judgment, concept, definition, ground, relation. But discourse in Aristotle, here a key source for Heidegger's concept of phenomenology, means to make manifest what is being talked about. When we give a logos of something in Aristotle, we make that thing apparent, the Greek word here being apophansis. Also in Aristotle's own demonstrative method, or in Heidegger's terms, indigenous Greek phenomenology, fully concrete discourse lets things be seen and has the character of a speaking or vocalization in words. This is the apophantical, to let something be seen in its togetherness with something, to let something be seen as something. This is why for Heidegger, logos cannot be appealed to as the primary place or taking place of truth. Logos is always apophantical, relation to what is shown in its togetherness by discourse, and so logos is always already phenomenological. Indeed, even attempting to approach the world in terms of realism or idealism, only matter exists or only ideas exist, seems to thoroughly miss the meaning of the Greek concept of truth as apophansis, or showing through logos. Modern realism and idealism speak of Plato's theory of ideas, oppose it to Aristotle's emphasis on forms in nature. This is to take the end as the starting point. In the ancient Greek conception of logos, the task is to discourse, to reveal things about things, precisely at the point of indistinction of any ultimate doctrines regarding reality and the ideas. So Heidegger presents his preliminary concept of phenomenology, developed as much from Aristotle as from Husserl, turning against Hegel's concept of phenomenology as dialectical. In Hegel, phenomenology means to watch the stages of consciousness as they successively unfold. Phenomenology of spirit means careful witnessing the dialectical unfoldings of the subjective spirit through the stages of perception, force, signification, ethicality, religion, and leading to the absolute self-knowing subject, an ongoing process of dialectical opposition and synthesis. Hegel's concept of phenomenology of spirit is thus a testimony to what has unfolded dialectically across the history of philosophy, a microcosm for the history of absolute spirit and subjective form. But Heidegger is going to break here with Hegel and present a concept of phenomenology as interpretive and historical, though at the same time as apophantical, revealing in logos, though in a middle-voiced mode, is not as positing of absolute subject or object, but rather as formally indicating phenomena in discourse. Ontology and phenomenology for Heidegger are not two different disciplines which, among others, belong to philosophy, but both terms characterize philosophy itself, its goal and procedure. So we get a definition of philosophy. It is universal phenomenological ontology, taking its departure from the interpretation or hermeneutic of Dasein, which, as an analysis of existenz, has fastened the end of the guideline of all philosophical inquiry at the point from which it arises and the point to which it returns, i.e. phenomena. My, what a marvelously ambitious project is Being in Time, if that's only the two introductions. Finishing the second one, he gives a kind of table of contents of the work as a whole, as well as how that work might be situated within a larger project never completed. The interpretation of Dasein as the basis of temporality, and the explication of time as the transcendental horizon of the question of being, will be the ultimate goal of part 1 of the work as a whole, comprising divisions 1, 2, and 3, division 3 never being published and its draft being burned. Part 2 was supposed to provide us with the basic features of a phenomenological destruction of the history of ontology along the guideline of the problem of temporality. In a way, even though division 3 and part 2 were never published, many of the subsequent volumes in Heidegger's Gesamtausgabe return to various aspects of these problematics sketched out in Being in Time. In detail, the structure of the work as a whole looks a little like this. Let's first perform in Division 1 the preparatory fundamental analysis of Dasein, so as in Division 2 to understand Dasein as temporality. Division 3 was supposed to get us as far as time and beings, in which analysis the hope was that the question of the meaning of being might be posed and perhaps eventually answered, at least to a gradual dismantling relation, to, in Part 2, Kant's doctrine of the schematism and time, ontological foundations of Descartes' Cogito Sum, and Aristotle's treatise on time as a way of discerning the phenomenal basis and the limits of ancient ontology. Had all this been accomplished in theory, Heidegger might have arrived at the meaning of being, but only the question concerning its meaning. Did Heidegger succeed in the end in this project? Yes and no. Retrospectives on Being in Time, predominantly positive, even in the form of just Division 1 and Division 2, its emphasis on hermeneutic phenomenology of Dasein and raising the question of time as the horizon for the meaning of being was immensely productive, and all of the existential structures discovered across Being in Time put to manifold use on various problematics, some of them related to those unfinished here, and also to various other domains in philosophy, poetry, literature, and culture. I don't have time to do a thorough readings of Division 1 and Division 2 of Being in Time in this class, but I've included in the slides, in addition to the main chart above, a basic breakdown of the development of the themes across Division 1. Within Heidegger studies, the Division 1 of the work received the lion's share of attention in earlier Heidegger studies, at least until the publication of Father John Richardson's monumental From Phenomenology to Thought, which situated the findings of Division 2 within the later Heidegger. Still today, there are many notable Heidegger scholars who consider Division 1 to be by far the most decisive, definitive, and productive part of the work. It is certainly true Heidegger labored over it the longest. But Division 2 at times is very rushed. A recent holder of the chair of Phenomenology held by Heidegger and Husserl at the University of Freiburg, Günter Figal, has also emphasized the theme of spatiality within the analysis of Dasein as being in the world in Division 1 as more fundamental than the analysis of temporality in Division 2. And it is certainly the case that Division 1 of being in time has been the most influential outside of Heidegger studies. Many a great Heidegger scholar, until at least quite recently, becoming anathema through any sort of emphasis on Division 2 or beyond. The main analyses in Division 1 of Dasein as being in the world include most famously the distinction of beings as ready to hand versus beings as present to hand, which speculative realism, beginning with Graham Harman, takes up as encoding a basic understanding of our being in the world as tools, that is, enworlded beings who treat the world as ready to hand, available for use, are themselves so available versus eruption, the moment of philosophical seeing, insight, when the tool breaks down, and we see for the first time the being of beings in their presence. The analysis of the present in hand indeed accounts for the genesis of objectification and even the possibility of science. Heidegger's analysis of the worldhood of the world and the who of Dasein, being with as an existential structure, and of Dasein as not differentiated from the they, that is das Man, has also been extremely influential, as has the analyses in Division 1 of distantiality and averageness, that is, of how Dasein spatializes its experience, what nearness and distance really mean in the ordinary and extraordinary sense. Division 1 of being in time goes on to discuss the modes of disclosure, that is, the very way in which Dasein discloses the world, and his analysis of attunement or mood, the primary phenomena of our existence, rooted in the past and determining through the present the character of our relation to the future, been inexhaustibly productive. The philosophy of human emotion and even affect theory. Heidegger's analysis of Dasein as thrownness and facticity, thrown into the world, into this particular facticity, Gemeinigkeit and Jeweiligkeit, mindness and wiling, of course, was taken up into the roots of Sartrean existentialism. Heidegger's analysis of them in being in time, as does his fundamental analysis of anxiety as a disclosure of Dasein's having to be, and relation to possible non-being, that is, to death. His analysis of falling away from oneself and into the they, and of understanding as a grasping or gathering of possibilities and projection into a future, always in terms of Dasein's self-interpretation within the hermeneutical circle, and alongside his rejection of the inauthentic phenomena of disclosure, which are idle talk, curiosity, and ambiguity, are truly inexhaustible, as is everything else in being in time. Division 1 as a whole includes that for the most part, Dasein is living its existence inauthentically, thrown into a world in which it is dominated by the one, the they. Dasein falls in with the others, understanding itself and how things go in the world the way they understand these things. Rather than being principles of social critique in Heidegger, the analyses are in fact existential, ontological structures of Dasein itself. And through falling in with, Dasein is tranquilized, disburdened, that is, relieved of the burden of being Dasein and the responsibility for its own way of being, and so flees the anxiety of having to take up this burden, flees itself, and falls away from itself into the world of the one, and this is inauthentic existence. Attunement is Dasein's relationship to its own having to be, and its showing up in moods. Moods show how Dasein is bearing the burden of having to be there. Understanding is a matter of grasping potentialities of being and interpreting them. Discourse puts things into words, expressing articulations of being. Authentically, Dasein expresses itself in idle chatter, gossip, and listening to what is said in the talk, rather than penetrating to the reality of what is being talked about. Very often in its attunement, Dasein degenerates into mere curiosity and never satisfied roaming about on the surface of things, tails off into ambiguity where it is unclear whether anything is understood or not. Gradually, by the end of Division 1 of being in time, that is, having fundamentally worked out the structures of being in the world, being in disclosedness, clearing, there, worldhood, projection, thrownness, fallenness, understanding, state of mind, the they, existentiality, facticity, falling, all leading to uncanniness, anxiety, the burden of having to be. The work then begins to turn in the last chapter of Division 1, Chapter 6, to the basic definition of Dasein, being in the world as care, understood as being already in the world and as the authentic potentiality for being oneself or becoming a whole. Such care is always ahead of itself, an authentic potentiality for being a whole, as well as a being alongside entities. It is significant that in grounding the analysis of Dasein as care, Heidegger reverts to a myth. This being Dasein has the origin of its being in care. Dasein is not released from this origin, but retained, dominated by it, so long as this being is in the world. Being in the world has the character of being of care. For Heidegger, what the care fable studied last week encodes is the pre-ontological characterization of the essence of the human being as a temporal sojourn in the world, formed from the earth, given spirit by Jupiter, and yet determined always by Saturn or time. Covering any of these aspects of Division 1 or Division 2 in more detail is beyond the purview of this survey class. Next week we'll begin with what is often considered the nutshell form, being in time as a whole, especially Division 2, the much more accessible speech that Heidegger delivered in 1925, the concept of time. We can consider this lecture as our return to Heidegger, the second lecture on Heidegger in the course, on the more technical beginnings, the two introductions to being in time, and the lead up to it. We'll pick up again next week where we left off here, the discussion of the most essential findings of the work. See you then, and I hope you have a good week.